This week's Farm Basics is brought to you by satshot.com. Satellites aren't just for NASA anymore. Use the power of satellite imagery to create variable rate management zones in your fields. To reduce input costs and increase yields on your farm, go to satshot.com.
During our Farm Basics time today, we wanted to talk a little bit about piles of corn. What are farmers doing and what are grain elevators doing making great big piles of corn? Doesn't it just spoil?
Here's the cool thing. When crops are really big, I don't care how many bins you've got, you don't have enough bins to hold the whole crop all at once. So as farmers get all of the crop out of the field and the last fields get combined, there's no place to go for them. So what farmers will do and grain elevators will do or grain buyers will do is they'll just pile it up outside on the ground. Now by the time we get to the end of harvest, it's getting pretty cold outside. We're talking about 40-degree daytime highs and night times that are freezing. At that point, your chance of spoilage is much less than earlier on in the season when daytime highs are still in the 60s or 70s, then spoilage will happen pretty quickly. So we got some cold temperatures. We also have a change in moisture. When it comes down, it's usually not in the liquid form anymore.
Well, if it is snow, it's a lot less problematic than if it is rain. So basically what we're talking about here is the two factors we have when it comes to spoilage are moisture and heat. So the cooler it is and the drier it is, the easier it is to keep grain in those piles. Now, for grain elevators that have great big piles, there are two different ways that they can have those piles. They can either have one point or one peak and have an enormous pile, or they can basically spread that out over a long distance and have a peak going all the way along. The ideal thing for grain elevators to do is have just one peak, because every peak you have, that's a point of major spoilage. So if a grain elevator is able to do it, they will only have one peak. If you see a grain elevator that just has one peak, not a whole line of peaks going along, that grain elevator manager, he was doing his job. He's going to have the least amount of spoilage since there's only one peak.
Well, you're focusing on the top of the pile.
Yep.
I'd like to focus on the bottom of the pile. You may say, well, wait a minute, what's underneath this pile? How do we prevent spoilage from the ground up? Well, there's a couple different things there as well. Many grain elevators will have a concrete pad or an asphalt pad, so they've got something firm underneath so they know there's no moisture coming up from underneath. The downside of that is, what if moisture comes from the top and works its way down? So what other places will do, whether it's a farmer or a grain elevator, they'll have it piled right on the ground, but they'll put something like lime down on the bottom. Lime will be fairly firm, so when you're trying to pick the pile up, you can get it picked up pretty nicely, but it'll also allow moisture to move down through it. So if there is some moisture, it moves down through the lime, keeping the corn fairly dry.
Now, another thing you'll see a lot of times is grain elevators will take a tarp and cover that great big pile. Tarps like that cost quite a bit of money, but that does help keep moisture out. Another thing you'll see from time to time is actually running, it looks like tile lines going through the pile, just a way that they can pump air through that pile. If air is allowed to blow through the pile, it allows the pile to not only cool down a little bit faster, but also sometimes push that moisture out. What the grain elevators will do is they'll wait for a very dry day, a day where the humidity is way down and where the temperature is cold, and then they'll pump as much air through that pile as they can to both freeze it and pump a little of the moisture out.
Well, you may say, well, wait a minute now, if we can just pile it outside, why do we need bins? Well, the reason why is in grain bins, where it's covered and it's not going to get wet at any point, and you can also control the climate in that bin, you can keep grain for a long period of time. With grain piles, even as far north as we are in South Dakota, you can only keep grain piles for so long. Most of the time, grain elevators will try to get through the main rush of harvest and then immediately start into that grain pile and move that grain out while the grain's still in good condition and still very valuable for the end user.
One last thing with grain piles, a lot of elevators will dry the grain first. They'll dry it down to, say, 14% moisture, and then they figure the grain, when it's out in the pile, will pick up another 1% moisture, so it'll end up at about 15, which when they haul it to a terminal or a feeder or something like that, there's no dock when the moisture is at 15%. So anyway, that's just a few of the basics about grain piles. A lot of times, farmers and grain elevators just have to do it if the yield in the overall area is exceptionally high and there's just nowhere to put that grain for a while. But the key is You just want to get that grain pile picked up as quickly as you can before you run into a lot of spoilage.
And the reason that we do have such a nice crop of corn this year is we got weeds under control, like our weed of the week. Can you identify this tough weed?